Welcome to the Crystal Fideli podcast. I am your host, Crystal Fideli. I am a social researcher and policy analyst, speaker, consultant, and an award-winning nonprofit founder and executive director. And all of my work focuses on helping us to understand coercive control, helping organizations to understand coercive control so they can respond better, and helping individuals understand coercive control so they can navigate the systems that they need to navigate better. And here on the Crystal Fideli podcast at large, we examine when institutional norms and practices diverge from what the research calls an evidence-based approach, being based on science, research, the law, etc., and instead reverts into using what the research calls a practice-based approach based on tradition and opinion, and how it causes an immense amount of harm to very vulnerable and marginalized people. And that leads me into introducing you to a special series we are doing here on the Crystal Fideli podcast called When Coercive Control Turns Financial, the Family Court Response and the Cascading Consequences. We see in the research and in practice time and time again when a woman attempts to set boundaries on the coercive control that she is experiencing, how the coercive control does not stop, because that's not how it works. Coercive control does not stop when a woman sets boundaries. It just switches forms and it intensifies until a person in power or an institution steps in and stops it. So she attempts to set boundaries, and most often it switches to financial. And we examine the family court's response and how that leads to so many cascading consequences. So welcome to this.
And today I am joined by Lundy Bancroft. He is the author of Why Does He Do That? And I meant to have my coffee right next to me, but it's over there. But I'm attached to my podcast mic. And if I get up, it's just going to be a whole thing. So I have it across the room, though, Lundy. He is a leading voice on coercive control and abusive dynamics. And his work reframed domestic violence as a pattern of power and entitlement rather than anger, and has shaped how advocates and professionals understand abuse for decades. So, Lundy, I am so happy to have you here. How are you today?
Thank you, Crystal. Doing well.
Good, good. Thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited to be able to ask you questions and just to learn as a student here today. So first, I want to get into, so in your work, you've emphasized that abuse is not primarily about anger, but about entitlement and coercive control. So could you walk us through what you see as the underlying drivers of coercive control in intimate partnerships?
So I think the people's typical assumption, which I started with too when I came into the field, but I had to let go of, is that a man who's behaving abusively is being driven primarily by his emotional states, that there's something going on with him that's making him feel too insecure, that's making him too angry, that he's too worried about his manhood. There's all these different things that people figured were coming from his emotional world. And I found from very early in my work actually counseling abusers and trying to get them to change that their emotional world was not really very different from non-abusive men, that they go through this, that we all go through the same stuff. We all get angry. We all have times when we feel insecure. We all have times when we feel jealous. And from a psychological standpoint, they were actually not that different. And now in years since, there's been a lot of research confirming that they're not particularly psychologically different. But at the time, it was just we were just seeing this in the group counseling that we were doing with men who were abusing women. And so it became clear to us, and now research has revealed that the problem with an abusive man is really primarily in his mind, not in his heart. That it's really about his values and attitudes, his belief system. Not that his emotional states are so intolerable compared to anybody else's emotional states. And there are also certain things that started to click to me, like you would hear this excuse of like, well, it's because they have a fear of abandonment, and that's why it's dangerous to leave an abuser, and that's why women can get killed sometimes when they leave an abuser, is because he has this terrible fear of abandonment. Well, women don't have any less fear of abandonment than men do. Why aren't men dying like flies when they try to leave relationships?
Yeah.
So more and more, it just started to not make sense. So it became really clear that abusers have these values that say a number of things that started to become really clear to us who were leading in the early days of abuse counseling, who were leading these groups. We would find the attitudes they had just by pushing them on their attitudes and getting them talking, and their attitudes would come out.
Mm.
And key pieces were that they believed that they have a right to control a woman once they're in a serious relationship with her,
Mm.
that they would believe that that woman owed them sex and that they owed sex on their terms.
Mm.
And to whatever extent they decided to attend to the woman's sexual desires or needs, that was just like nice, generous of them, but it wasn't their responsibility. It was her responsibility to take care of his needs sexually.
Mm.
That they believed in all kinds of double standards, that she shouldn't be even looking at other men, but he could be like outright cheating on her.
Mm.
And he believed he had the right to rule, that he has the right, for example, to tell her when she has to shut up,
Mm.
that he has the right to not respect her boundaries. If she says, leave me alone, I want to be alone right now, he gets to just say, well, no, you're not going to be alone right now. You're going to talk to me right now.
Yeah.
And that he has the right to control what's going on in the finances of the relationship. And you use the word entitlement, and that's really on target, because he believes that he's entitled to behave in these ways and that it's what she owes him because they're in a relationship.
Yeah.
And he can be giving 10% of what she's giving and still feel like she should be grateful to him for the 10% that he's giving. And whereas the 90% that she's giving, he just feels like, oh, I'm entitled to that. That's my due.
Yeah.
And these dynamics of his values, his justifications, just turned out to be so much more powerful than what's going on with him emotionally. And that when you attempt to bring about change in an abuser by trying to change his emotional world, the way he treats women doesn't change at all.
Yeah.
Whereas we found that when you really go after his attitudes and confront them and challenge them and demand that they change, you sometimes start to see some change in abusers, particularly if they're also in legal trouble. That helps a lot.
Outside, not reinforcement, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Can I ask, did you see any success? Were you able to kind of excavate those beliefs and challenge them successfully?
We did, but we didn't see tremendous success, and it's because there's just not enough support from other resources. An abuser program can't be successful in a vacuum. If you're trying to change someone's values and attitudes, well, someone's values and attitudes took years to develop.
Yeah.
And so a program that you're going to for 2 hours a week, or unfortunately, a lot of times it's an hour and a half a week. I think those groups are too short, but
Yeah.
that's for 6 months or something. How is that going to change 20 years of these development of values and attitudes unless they're also getting the same message from a bunch of other places? It would be different if the legal system would be tough on abusers. It would be different if their own relatives were calling them out instead of backing them up.
Yes.
It would be different if other men in their lives were calling them out instead of backing them up. It would be different if they weren't seeing so much stuff in TV and movies and video games and websites that are encouraging their mentality. If they weren't, on the manosphere learning that, all these negative ways of thinking about women that are just reinforcing their mindset.
Yeah.
Then in those situations, the abuser program is just a voice in the wilderness. When we did have success, and we did have some successes, we did have some guys who made really big changes. It wasn't just because of what we did. It was because of other messages that also lined up with what we were doing, that this guy was getting from a bunch of additional places in his life.
Yeah. Give me 1 second. I have to cough. I'm getting over a cold here. Yeah, that is so important. And probably belief systems that were developed really early on in life too, right?
Typically, yes. Typically, he started learning from maybe his own dad or stepdad or grandparents or uncles were that way. But they also learn it from peers. They learn it from sports coaches. They learn it from books and magazines and movies, television that they watch. And nowadays, boys are heavily socialized by video games and a bunch of all kinds of other sources. So yeah, they start learning from very early in life that males just get to require females to do things for them. If the female's not doing something for you that you want her to do, you get to make her do it.
Yes. I was just watching on TikTok yesterday, and I came across this video on my For You page, and it was like a skit. And after learning about all of this and really delving into the research, listening to podcasts such as the many that you've been on, it's like I see it now. I see it in the pop culture, in the movie culture. And I almost like I was uncomfortable. I couldn't even watch it because it's like once you see it, everything that you're describing, you know what I mean? You see it so differently, you know? It's just interesting.
There's a great series right now, limited series on just 4 episodes on Netflix. This story called movie called Adolescence, and it's really about the kind of messages that teen boys specifically, are getting about girls and women. And it's without it feeling like it's not a movie that feels like it's preaching to you politically, but the messages are there, and it's really powerful and really well done. And the guy who's plays the father in it was also one of the main writers of the show.
Yeah.
And it's something I really recommend to look at, like, where are boys learning these terrible ways of thinking about women, girls and women?
Yeah. It's so important. Before coming across your work, I never thought of it like that. It's almost kind of like a sociology lens that you're looking at it. Yeah. Which is interesting because I am a sociologist, but so one of my masters is in social research and analysis. But yeah, it was very interesting because I used to view it through a mental health lens as well. But you know, anyways, and so I guess maybe this is kind of uh, sort of answered this already. But why do you think so many professionals, judges, therapists, attorneys, these outside entities we're talking about that we really need to um, reinforce what your program was teaching for an hour and a half a week, right? They misinterpret these dynamics as conflict, communication problems, or mutual dysfunction rather than recognizing it as a pattern of control. Well, I guess it's probably because the culture, right? But I'd be curious to hear if you had anything to say about that.
I think there are multiple causes, but certainly the fact that they're products of this same culture, yes, that's
Yeah.
absolutely a big factor, and which leads them to judge men's behavior and women's behavior very differently, for example. So when a woman is visibly angry and agitated in court, that counts against her tremendously. They start to say, look
Yes.
how volatile she is. When a man is agitated and angry in court, in a family court, in a custody court, they'll say, well, oh, but look, he's got a lot to be mad about. You can
Mm,
understand why he's so frustrated. So it's like two completely different ways of judging.
yeah.
If a man spends a little bit of time with his kids in a caring, loving way, it's like, oh, look what he's doing as a father. It's so amazing. A mother is expected to spend huge amounts of good, loving time with her kids. There's a completely different standard that she's being judged by.
Yeah.
If a father disappears for 5 years and then reappears and wants to be in the children's lives, they're like, well, look, yeah, it's too bad that he disappeared for those 5 years, but look, he's back. Isn't that good? He wants to be in his children's life now.
Right.
If a mother disappeared from her children's lives for 5 years and now decides she wanted to be reinvolved, the court is not like, well, that's so good that she's back. The court's like, where the hell has she been for 5 years? And so the double standards are very intense. And then the huge problem that we have in our time is that custody battles have become a vast cash cow.
Yeah.
And if you're in the system as a lawyer, as a custody evaluator, as a therapist, they now have this thing called reunification therapists. They have parent coordinators. The roles are just multiplying and multiplying. Psych
Yeah.
evaluators, custody evaluators. These people are all making unbelievable amounts of money.
Yeah.
And they often know the judges. They went to law school together. They serve on certain committees together. They hang out socially together. The judges may have come from a practice like this before they became judges. They may go back to a practice like this when they're no longer on the bench. It's so interwoven. And one of my more recent things that I've started to say about the child custody system is it's really the only line of work that I know of in which the worse you do your job, the more money you make.
You said it, not me.
Because if you do your job well, conflicts get resolved and you don't make a lot of money.
Yeah.
If you do your job badly, conflicts will drag on for years, which they will blame both parents for, but mostly they'll blame the mother for.
Yeah.
And but that's why this conflict can't be resolved. It's like, well, because you, the court personnel, haven't done anything. You've refused to look at what the key issues.
Yeah.
You refuse to look at what the key issues are. Of course, the conflict is going to drag on endlessly because the abuser is not going to be stopped.
Yeah. Yes. Oh my gosh, that is so right. And it puts survivors in such a dangerous position and really a double bind. It's really, sad. It's the work that the nonprofit You Made a Way really does. So yeah, it's so sad.
And it's not in any way thinking well about what children's needs are.
Yeah.
And these judges and custody evaluators will all keep saying like a mantra, the best interest of the child, the best interest of the child, while they completely ignore the best interest of the child.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And so getting into family court and kind of getting into the financial coercive control. So after separation, when an abusive partner, no longer has physical proximity, where the coercive control can manifest more psychologically, emotionally, mentally, perhaps physically, maybe in other ways, right? But how do you see coercive control evolve? In particular, what role can financial leverage, delayed support, or litigation strategy play in maintaining control, especially in cases involving stay-at-home mothers who remain primary caregivers?
Let me take a step back that'll help me to answer that question, which is that to first understand that that abusiveness is not a relationship problem. It's a problem in the abuser. It's not caused by the dynamics of the relationship. The dynamics of the relationship are caused by his abuse. So you're reversing cause and effect when you say that his behavior is caused by the relationship dynamics. And
Right.
the reason that's so important to understand is that means that when they split up, nothing is going to change
Right.
in how he thinks or how he behaves. This
Right.
is different from what may go on in other couples where sometimes things do settle down and improve after they split up, but that's not going to happen when you have an abuser in the picture.
Right.
And this is a lot of the mistakes that get made are made from applying things that happen with non-abusers to what's going to happen with an abuser. Well,
Yes.
I'll give another example. Non-abusive dads sometimes who were under-involved as fathers for various cultural and work reasons beforehand, sometimes actually become better dads after the couple splits up, because they sort of have to step up. The abuser does not become a better dad. He may fake being a better dad for a year or two while he's in litigation, but he never becomes a lastingly better dad after the couple splits up. So his issues are not going away. And his key issue is he believes in his right to control her and to punish her, and he is determined to control her and punish her. And as you've just said, he doesn't get to do that through day-to-day contact anymore. So what remains to him? Three things, basically: to try to ruin her reputation, to try to destroy her financially, and to try to see how much pain and suffering he can cause her through the children,
Right.
which often means by trying to very actively turn the children against her and pull them away from her because he knows nothing could hurt her more than that. Um,
Yeah.
so the litigation becomes in itself a way to destroy her financially.
Right.
It's like every time you got to go to court, that represents so much money. It represents time that she's losing from work, and it represents time that she has to pay lawyers, evaluators, et cetera.
Right.
And abusers will, for example, just use repetitive court dates over stupid stuff, which the court refuses to say, you can't keep coming in here with stupid stuff. They just let him do that. Doesn't matter how frivolous it is. That in itself becomes a great way to do great financial harm.
Yeah.
And then he's going to get all this, he gets all this unsupervised time with the children, regardless of the history of domestic violence. He is always given extensive unsupervised time. Sometimes it takes a little while. Sometimes there's a brief period when his visits are supervised. It never lasts very long. And usually there's no period when his visits are supervised. He's like, even though he's been abusing the mother, he's right into unsupervised contact with those kids. Well,
Right.
what do we know about a man who abuses children's mother? We know that he's out to do damage to mother-child relationships. It's
Yeah.
almost universal among men if they abuse a woman while she's got kids.
Yeah.
And so he starts to use his visitation time to poison those kids against their moms, and really serious stuff starts to happen. And then we can get more into that. But
Yeah.
from the financial standpoint, this becomes such a weapon to destroy her with. And often in our times, what the court thinks of as a fair financial settlement is completely unfair. And you're talking about, for example, a woman who doesn't have a separate income. Well, the bizarre thing is that courts nowadays are almost treating that as something to punish her for. Like, well,
Yeah.
she should be bringing in money.
Yeah.
But of course, if she is bringing in money, then it's like, well, why isn't she spending that time with her kids? So she can't win.
Right. And there's no equal symmetrical pressure put on him. Why aren't you stepping up your caretaking, right? It's like, there's I always talk about the marital division of labor because the focus of my research is on these temporary interim financial orders that disproportionately burden the non-moneyed stay-at-home moms, right? And insulate the coercive controller who, is cutting her off financially to punish her for leaving the relationship, right? And yeah, and it's like there's this thing called the marital division of labor, right? There's because marriage is a economic partnership, and that encompasses the income earning and the caretaking, right? And so there's no pressure in my experience and what I've seen in the research, pressure put on the income earner to lower his income earning a bit to step up his caretaking, so the caretaker can step down her caretaking and step up her income earning, so there can be some sort of equitable, maybe not equal, but like equitable, outcome. And it's like now the pressure is put on her to, first of all, she's financially cut off, and she's lucky if she even gets what is called a household expense order, which does not encompass food, gasoline, medical needs, litigation, so she can properly have a legal argument properly framed, right? And then she's expected to somehow bypass the transition period of alimony and rehabilitating to get back into the workforce, and and to have that smooth transition period, and then she's almost punished by the court system. And I don't say that to criticize the court system. My hope is to create awareness so we can create change, but she's punished for not having a job, but she's also expected to full-time caretake under such deprivation. Have you seen that, Lundy, in your work?
I've seen nothing but that, unfortunately, in how the family, or with only very rare exceptions, I guess I should say, to be more fair, in how the family law system operates. And tremendous class prejudice is mixed in with all the things that you say, so that an evaluator, for example, will go look at the woman's home and go look at the man's home and say, oh, just think, maybe even somewhat unconsciously, like, well, I'd sort of rather be in this nicer house. And then rather than saying, okay, we need to do something about the financial orders on this case so that the father is not living under so much better circumstances than the mother is,
Right.
the evaluator starts to think, oh, we should really have the kids living primarily in this nicer neighborhood, or what. So that's the class prejudice has become an additional factor. But everything that you're describing, Crystal, is right on point of what goes on. And these double standards are really painful to watch, and they're terrible for kids.
Yeah. Yes. I don't understand. To me, it just seems like 1 + 1 = 2. I don't understand how somebody could come to these conclusions, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So for example, a reasonable thing, but I've never seen it happen in the court, is that the court should analyze the differences in income and then charge fees on that basis.
Yeah.
So if he's making twice as much money as she is, then he should have to pay a substantial part of her lawyer fees.
Yeah. Especially if he's not complying, and that's why she needs a lawyer.
Well, which is so often the case. With an abusive guy, compliance is a complete pain in the butt. They don't comply.
Yeah. Right.
And the trying to get courts to simply enforce their own orders is bizarrely difficult for a mother to do when she's divorcing or splitting up from an abuser who's unfortunately the father of her kids. And the dividing up of who's going to have to pay for a psychological evaluation or who's going to have to pay for a custody evaluation, they get charged the same amount. It doesn't get divided by what their incomes are. And then I've made a whole sheet, which I'll share with you, about what I think are just common sense custody reforms that would be good for both mothers and fathers, that everybody in a reasonable world would agree to.
Yeah.
And one of those is that anyone that the court is ordering parents to pay money to that isn't part of the court system, psychological evaluators, custody evaluators, anyone out there, should not be allowed to bill the parents.
Yeah.
They should have to bill the court, and the court bills the parents, so
Yeah.
that the court would always see all the bills and would always know exactly what the parents were being charged and what they were being charged. Because custody evaluators will charge absurd amounts of money
Yeah.
for their work, have failed to have met with the kids. And a lot of your listeners may not believe this, but over and over and over again, I hear from parents, mostly from moms, I've got this huge bill from a custody evaluator who never met with my kids.
Right. Yeah. It's such an exploitation. I hate to say that because I'm not trying to criticize the institution, but yeah, it's really happening. So,
I'm happy to criticize the institution, so I'll do
okay. I want them to listen to me. but yeah, it's really, I don't understand why they permit this. I certainly wouldn't if I was on the bench, but yeah. So,
that. And by the way, most of the public, when they learn what's going on in custody court, is appalled by it.
yeah,
So the problem isn't like persuading people that this is wrong. It's the problem is getting people to even know that these things are happening. Because anyone
true.
who finds out that these things are happening is appalled.
Yes.
And so there's really no need to convince people. In my experience, there's the need to inform people.
Yeah.
So that there starts to be, we need a huge upswell of demand for family court reform.
Yes, yes. And that's what I always say because I'm not one of these, advocates that think that we need to just do away with family court. I think we need it, so especially, when a woman has exhausted therapy and her own means to try to solve the situation, she has no other choice but to turn to the institution of the family court. And we need the family court to know about this and respond better, enforce these orders, know how to really see what's going on and take a hard stance against these men who are clearly showing indicators that they are abusive.
And you've got a lot of men out there saying, "Oh, I was falsely accused of domestic violence, or I was falsely accused of child sexual abuse." They're mostly lying, but some of them are probably telling the truth. But they would, the kinds of reforms that I'm proposing, they would have every reason to be in favor of. Like the kinds of reforms I'm proposing are, once there is an allegation of domestic violence, a report, I don't like calling it an allegation, once there is a report of domestic violence or child sexual abuse, the court now has to follow the following set of steps.
Yeah.
And then those steps are laid out. Well, that will benefit the parent who's telling the truth every time.
Yeah.
And usually it's the parent raising the allegation, but once in a while there are unfair or exaggerated or false allegations being made. Well, that parent would also benefit from a thorough assessment that had to follow a certain set of steps.
Yeah.
But what I notice a lot is these so-called fathers' rights organizations, they're mostly not advocating for a really clear set of steps for things to be thoroughly and properly and objectively evaluated.
Ah, how interesting.
They're advocating for mothers just to not be believed.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think, well, that's not mostly responsible fathers that are joining those organizations. That's not mostly genuinely aggrieved fathers.
Right.
The genuinely aggrieved fathers would want to quickly sign up for the same set of reforms that I'm proposing because it would benefit them too.
Yeah, exactly. And let me know what you think about this because so coercive control is the root cause, right? And so we can see it pop up physically, psychologically, financially, through process abuse, co-parenting, custody, etc., right? So let me know what you think about this. So this is my theory. I could be wrong. But if we see financial coercive control, and you always seem to go back to financial coercive control because that's literally the thing that we target here at You Made a Way. That's what we help with and through the family court system when you are encountering financial coercive control. But if you see financial coercive control, I think that's a really good indicator that if a woman was cut off overnight from the marital income, right, that's a really good indication that there probably was physical abuse or psychological abuse, and that there's going to be other abuse down the line.
Not only that, but it's a major indicator that this is someone who doesn't really care about his children's needs.
Yeah.
Because if you really care about your children's needs, you don't do that to the mother, even if you hate her and never want to talk to her again,
Right.
because you just see how bad that would be for your kids. And I would go a step further and say, if you really care about your kids, you don't abuse their mother
Yes.
because you see how terrible that is for your kids. If you need to divorce her because you can't stand her anymore, then you need to divorce her because you can't stand her anymore.
Yeah.
But you don't start ripping her down, calling her horrible names, threatening her, cutting her off financially,
Yeah.
etc. If you give a hoot about how that's going to affect your kids. And if you're doing one of the things that's the most destructive things you could do to your kids, which is abusing their mother, what are the chances that that's going to be the only bad way you're harming your kids? If you can do one of the things that's absolute worst thing you could do for your kids, then you're almost certainly going to be doing some other things that are really bad for those kids too.
Yes.
So I get very frustrated when I hear court personnel and court allied personnel, lawyers, et cetera, saying, well, yeah, it looks like he probably did abuse the mother, but he's a really good father. It's like, no, really good fathers don't abuse their children's mother.
Yeah.
It's bad fathering.
Yeah, exactly. And because if for nothing else, it is making that woman stressed out all day, every day, and her kids are with her. They sense the stress, you know?
And it's teaching your kids that it's okay to treat your mother that way, which is damaging their relationships with their mother.
Yeah.
So it's just immediately in itself causing so many problems. And I've written 2 books about it. I wrote a book called The Batterer's Parent, which is crazy expensive, unfortunately. And then I wrote a book called When Dad Hurts Mom, where I explain all the different ways that he ends up harming kids, and particularly through damaging their relationship with their moms. I got put onto this because I started to notice in research that I was reading that kids' trauma from witnessing domestic violence was coming largely from the damage that it was doing to their relationships with their moms.
Yeah.
It's also coming from other things like the violence, for example. Those incidents are traumatic in themselves.
Yes.
But it became clear that so much of the damage was being done through the ways they were being driven apart from their moms, and the way, as you're saying, her parenting life was also getting so much more difficult because she's under so much stress. And I would add, because her maternal authority is being completely sabotaged and undercut.
Yeah.
And
by him and the court.
Right. And so my belief is that, well, I'll explain this concept. I believe that mothers are put under a double burden of proof.
Yeah.
First of all, she has to prove to the court's satisfaction that he really has been abusive to her.
Mm-hmm.
Then, if she meets that burden of proof, she has to meet an additional burden of proof, which is almost impossible to meet, that therefore his visits should be supervised.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe she shouldn't have to meet a double burden of proof. If she meets the burden of proof that he has been abusing her, then the second burden of proof should switch to him.
Yeah.
And it should be up to him to prove that he's appropriate for unsupervised contact, not up to her to prove that he's not.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. The disproportionate burden of proof that is placed on women is it's really unfair and astronomically unbalanced.
And what there is now, I'm sure you've dealt with this huge scourge, a completely unscientific thing called parental alienation.
Yeah.
And it used to be called parental alienation syndrome, but they've mostly dropped the term syndrome, but without dropping any of the thinking behind it. And by the way, everybody should be aware that this is an accusation that is used almost 100% against mothers. And in fact, the person who created the theory, this guy who has now died, Richard Gardner, he said explicitly in his writing that he believed almost all parental alienators were mothers. Mm. So how can you take a theory seriously to even begin with that is that overtly anti-mother?
Yeah.
But what goes on in the court now is that the burden of proof to show that he has abused mom, to show that he has physically abused the children, to show that he has sexually abused the children, there is an extremely high bar in the court's eyes to prove that any of those things is true.
Yeah.
To prove that she's an alienator, nothing. All he has to do is come in and say she's
Yeah.
alienating the children from me, and the court right away is like, oh, she's alienating the children. So why are those bars set not only in two different places, but two absolutely opposite extremes, where the bars for everything else are set extremely high.
Yeah.
For anything about him, the bar that she's an alienator is set rock bottom.
That would be a really interesting research project. So, as I shared, I am a researcher, a social researcher, and a policy analyst. And I have a gal on my team. She actually works at, a university. So she's connected with an IRB, and we've been discussing some research projects that we want to, do. And so that actually might be a really interesting project to propose to her on Monday night for my team meeting. To kind of informally, just interview people who have had that experience, and then to go in there and do, some interviewing, or whether qualitative or quantitative, whether through like a survey or interviews, and then to actually go pull, the court transcripts, and to kind of, look through to see, you know what I mean? To just like get some data to see how to prove through data, like how this is, happening, and it's a disproportionate burden. So.
That'd be great, and I'd be happy to talk to you about some possible ways to look at that. And
Yeah.
while we're on that subject, I want to mention one other quick thing, which is that the moms who've become aware of how common it is that abusers are trying to destroy mother-child relationships sometimes think, oh, well, then parental alienation theory is a good thing, because look, he's doing that, and will start to claim parental alienation, or may even start to join organizations that are spreading the concept of parental alienation, not realizing that that's used almost exclusively against mothers.
Yeah.
So we recommend a different term. So
yeah. I was going to ask you, what is the term?
The term is domestic violence by proxy.
Okay. I've heard of that before.
Which means the children are being used as a way to harm her. That's what that term
TP by
means. The
proxy.
children are a proxy to hurt her with.
Yeah.
And so that we're not supporting this parental alienation nightmare by joining in with the use of that term. So when you're talking about a guy who has abused you, turning the kids against you, we would prefer that you not call that parental alienation, that you call that domestic violence by proxy.
Yeah.
So to make a clear distinction that we're not getting involved in the absurd set of theories and the whole Richard Gardner's, a lot of court professionals have now said, oh, well, we don't believe in Richard Gardner anymore, but they're still following almost exactly what he proposed.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's really good, because changing the terminology is so important, because as humans, when we use a specific word like alcoholic, for example, which is my first ever subject matter expertise, but that's a whole different discussion. But what I mean is that there's a whole set of biases attached to that term, right? And they might not be fair, and they might not be accurate. Well, they're not accurate, and they're not fair. And so parental alienation is one of those terms. So let me ask you this. What risks do you see when financial access is minimized or delayed during the court process, right? Because I have women who come to me, stories pour in around the country through my emails, my DMs, hopefully my online forum, because that's the correct funnel to get people, support and to get them on the podcast. But irregardless, I funnel them to the correct place. Where they lost access to their marital income overnight, despite being stay-at-home moms and full-time caretaking with the kids, which is directly enabling that income, right? And just loses access overnight. And then courts years later have still not ordered support. And so I guess my question to you is, what risks do you see?
Well, we see all kinds of things happen. But we see kids start to be living in very, very tense homes, because there's suddenly huge tensions about school supplies and food and necessary clothing. And then that completely opens the door for the abuser to manipulate those kids, because suddenly he's the source of their clothing, and he's there, and they're getting to have way better food when they're at his house, and more
fun activities.
They're getting to go out and do all this great stuff. They're getting to go karting. They're getting to go to the amusement park. Mom can't do all those things. Kids start to perceive mom as selfish. Say, well, God, mom, how come you won't spend any money? Dad, of course, it's because she doesn't have any money, because he's not carrying his weight financially. And so it's completely inviting the dad to turn the kids against the mom and to make them start to want to be at his home. And we do not want kids to be falling more heavily under the influence of their domestic violence perpetrating fathers.
Yeah.
They need their mother in a domestic violence case. They do not need extensive influence from their father. They may need to spend a little bit of time with him. They need to see him. He's their dad. They want some time with him. They
Yeah.
do not need his extensive influence. The research is very clear that the more boys are influenced by their domestic violence perpetrating fathers,
The cycle repeats.
the more likely they are to become batterers themselves
Yeah.
of women. And it's the research is very clear that it's in the ways that they are indoctrinated into his mentality. There's really interesting research studies on this. That's the pathway through which they then become abusers and, by the way, also rapists of women themselves. And this is
Yeah.
very strong in the research. The family court doesn't seem to care about all this research. The family court's
Yes.
attitude is, well, they should have as much time with him as possible. It's like, well, the research does not support that. The research would support that for a really responsible father, but it does not support that for the domestic violence perpetrator.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's my goal, is to get family court to take this financial coercive control, which is domestic violence, in my opinion, more seriously. So then let's get into our last little bit here, institutional reinforcement and reform. So, from your perspective, where do the legal and therapeutic systems most often underestimate or misunderstand coercive control and post-separation financial disputes? Like, why do you think responsibility is so often shifted to the non-abusive partner? So, for example, being told to communicate better or just get a job rather than examining the pattern of coercive control. I think you've talked about this a little bit, but
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've said some things about it, and the roots that we have as a society in mother blaming still run very, very deep. Things go wrong with kids, must be the mother's fault.
yeah.
But the
Even though we set things up to go wrong, and then she's still blamed, and she's like, "I've asked you for help, court, and you're not helping."
um, but
Um,
there are a number of other things playing in here. I've also just already talked about how you make your money if you're a lawyer or a custody evaluator or all these other people that are involved in these custody professionals that are involved in these custody cases. But on top of that, we also have complete lack of understanding about trauma.
mm,
So a mom will be in court and have trouble describing what day and
yeah,
date and what year certain things were that he did. Well, trauma survivors are not going to have an easy time telling you, oh, that was Thursday, the 23rd of September of
right.
2004. And it's just these absurd expectations of someone who's been traumatized by domestic violence.
And
And
she's pro se, and the other side, because she's been financially cut off, so she's forced to proceed pro se, which is already traumatizing. And he has representation, and so his credibility is intact. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt,
no,
but
no, that please,
yeah,
please. No, that's very, very common.
yeah,
Or very commonly, she is represented, but not by someone who's nearly the kind of aggressive fighter that the father's lawyer is.
right,
And then there's a myth, very widespread myth, that an abuser would look like an abuser in court.
yeah,
And so they keep dismissing her concerns because they've had lovely interactions with him. It's like, oh,
yes, they present well.
I've talked to him. He's so sweet. He cries even when he talks about how much he misses his children. Well, he's
Yeah,
not crying because he's a loving father. He's crying because he's a narcissist, and narcissists can, or he's often a narcissist. And guys that are that self-centered, people that are that self-centered
manipulative.
can produce tears when they want to produce tears.
Yeah,
And actually, I shouldn't have said narcissist because I think there's a huge overestimating of how many abusers are narcissists. Is that there's actually a much smaller proportion it doesn't matter. They're just as destructive whether they're narcissists or not.
abusive traits.
But that have these abusive traits and behaviors and attitudes. And so that the fact that he's not going to look anything like what they think an abuser would look like. Oh, they also have huge class prejudices about what an abuser would look
Yeah,
like. They tend to think that abuse is a behavior that's much more likely to come from a low income man.
yeah,
Again, the research is very clear that the high income, high education man is just as likely to be an abuser. It's got nothing to do with class.
yeah,
And as the low income man is, that the per capita rate, that abusers are about one man in six, wherever you are on the socioeconomic scale. And So yeah, those problems compounded too. But there's one more thing that I think is really compounding it here, which is that the there's been big changes in society, not just in the US, but around a lot of the world over the last 40 years in our understandings about abuse of children and in our understandings about the abuse of women. And and uh, the so a lot of relationships now are breaking up that would not have broken up before because
Yeah.
the society is now sending the message to women, you shouldn't have to live this way. Your children should not have to live this way. You have the right to leave.
Yeah.
There's even some resources now that allow women to leave. So divorces now, and again, there's research on this showing that domestic violence is far and away the top cause of divorce.
Yeah.
So 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 family courts need to completely change the way they're doing everything because the divorces are now mostly being driven by abuse and not by like because the parents can't get along kind of thing.
Right.
Obviously, those divorces are there too, but the family court is scrambling to figure out how to keep doing things the same way it's always done them. And unfortunately, there have been researchers like Janet Johnston, pseudo researchers, in my opinion, who've Joan Kelly and some others who've created entire systems of completely flawed thought. I did a whole chapter about this in my book, The Batter as Parent, about how absurd these other theories are that essentially equip the court with excuses to continue doing what it has always done. So that's also part of the problem is just the court's reluctance to realize it has to completely change the way it does business in custody evaluation.
Yeah. Perhaps we need to, just as the abusive perpetrators have belief systems, right? The family court professionals have belief systems that we need to uproot, but hopefully they don't stem from an entitled, mindset. Hopefully it's just maybe, what's a better word for just a lack of knowing. I was going to say ignorance, but that's a rude word to say, but, just a lack of knowing. And so hopefully it'll be easier to change the way, hopefully, or invite them into a changed way of thinking.
I would love to see that. Unfortunately, because they're making so much money off of thinking in bad ways, I think that they're probably, in my experience, because I've done a lot of training of family court personnel, I've probably trained family court personnel in a dozen different states,
Hmm.
and their receptivity is low. And so I do think it's going to take a willingness to really follow where the money's going. And
Hashtag make family court nonprofit.
yeah, yes, yeah.
So, Lundy, let me ask you if it sort of last question before we wrap up here. If meaningful accountability, right? Because the only thing that creates change is accountability for these perpetrators, right? So, if meaningful accountability is the only intervention that changes abusive behavior, what would accountability look like in a family court context?
Well, he would have to be in an abuser program that was high quality. Of course, a lot of places don't have a high quality abuser. Most places don't have a high quality abuser program. So then there would also have to be proper funding and training of abuser programs so that of high quality abuser programs so that they would exist.
Yeah.
But there needs to be actual enforcement of court orders. There has to be proper assessment to begin with rather than the dismissing of her concerns.
Yes.
And the court has to send him a message. You're actually going to have to obey this order.
Yes.
And there has to be a willingness to cut his time with the kids if he's not obeying court orders.
Yes.
And there's been no willingness to do that. And I would say fundamentally, it means that anytime there's a case that's got domestic violence reports, it's got to go down a different pathway.
Yeah.
Or child abuse for that matter. It's like these cases have to be bifurcated. Now that this is
Yeah.
a potential domestic violence case, we don't have to decide ahead of time that it's true, but we've got serious concerns being raised here. This has to go down follow a whole other protocol,
Yeah.
and it has to follow an accountability oriented protocol. And if he's been somehow unfairly accused of being abusive, well, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for him to demonstrate that if
Yeah.
you're following a proper protocol.
Yeah.
And we have there's been a tremendous reluctance on the part of the court, an almost total reluctance to involve domestic violence experts in any way in the actual development of policies. They're sometimes willing to have a domestic violence expert testify on a case. I've done a certain amount of expert testimony in a case, though judges have put very little weight on my testimony. They'll say, yeah, he's an expert, but then they'll pretty much ignore what I say.
Yeah.
But to actually have domestic violence experts involved in their protocols, like how should these cases be investigated and handled? Zero. So we need a very thoroughgoing redevelopment of how custody determinations are made.
Yeah, this is true. So what I'm hearing you saying is that if there is a DV allegation, right, there needs to be an evidence-based almost, right, protocol of how to handle the case. Because if it's really not, if it is a false allegation, well, then we want to discover that because we don't want to falsely accuse people because that does happen too. It does happen, right? But what we're doing now is we're deterring survivors from being honest, and nobody's getting helped. It's getting worse because it just escalates. It doesn't get better. It actually gets worse. The more, because that's enabling it. And so the more it could be a she too, but the more the perpetrator is going to feel emboldened, like they're getting away with it. And they almost probably get, I think, like a, I don't know how do I say it? Like they almost feel like it's a good feeling. Like I got away with it. Yes. And so they're emboldened, So.
And the court is completely ignoring the research. For example, we've got multiple research studies showing that a man who is violent towards a mom is more than 6 times as likely as another man to be a sexual abuser of those children, to be an incest perpetrator of those children.
I didn't know that.
And so
makes sense though.
So once you know there's evidence of domestic violence towards mom, you should be taking any sign of boundary violations very seriously.
Yes.
And the court response tends to be, well, these are subtle kinds of boundary violations. It's like, this is already an established domestic violence case. We already know he was violent towards mom. There is no such thing anymore as a subtle boundary violation, given what we know statistically about the overlap between domestic violence perpetration and incest perpetration.
Yeah.
And what's happening is that both child sexual abuse allegations and domestic violence allegations are being dismissed on the basis of myth. So one of the things that we need to be written into court policies is you can't decide that an allegation was not true based on any of the following myths. You have to base it on the evidence. You keep talking. You've made several reference to the need to be looking at the evidence.
Yeah.
And so many decisions are made in family law proceedings based on psychological theories. It's like, no, those have no place. This is a court.
Yes, it's supposed to be based on evidence.
Evidence is supposed to be based on evidence.
Yeah.
I mean, decisions, rulings are supposed to be based on evidence, not on psychological theories. And cases where there are serious concerns, and the evidence would persuade any reasonable person that he'd been violent towards his mother or terrifying towards her or both. It would persuade any reasonable person that this guy was seriously violating children's boundaries and pretty likely doing outright sexual abuse, are being dismissed by the courts for reasons of complete mythology. Well, an incest perpetrator wouldn't be like such and such when there's no evidence that an incest perpetrator wouldn't be like such and such, or a batterer wouldn't be like such and such. To complete mythology, no basis in research whatsoever.
Yeah.
So that's one of the many needs is we have to say, sorry, you can't operate from myth.
Yeah. Yeah. That's actually one of my core tenets of like my platform, my brand, just my work is evidence-based, whether the law is the evidence-based we're following, like literally what the statutes and the case law, right, and the procedures say, right, or actual research, data. It's so important because, it's just when it's practice-based, which especially in alcohol recovery, the alcohol recovery field is largely practice-based, which the peer-reviewed research defines as being based on tradition. So the way we've always thought of it and done it, right, and approached it, and opinion, provider opinion. And it's like, well, that's why the data is atrocious and people aren't even seeking help for the most part. 90% never seek help, 10% who do wait on average 10 years, and not many are actually truly able to have long lasting recovery and a quality of life recovery, longevity and recovery. But anyways, it's sort of the same idea is applicable to coercive control and family court. It needs to be evidence-based, not practice-based. Everybody has an opinion. It doesn't make it correct. The evidence base gives us for the most amount of people, the most amount of time and in the best way possible, right? And that's why I'm a big proponent of evidence base. So,
And then I would argue, in addition, that when we're talking about evidence, we also mean the evidence from this case,
yes.
not just evidence-based research, but what's the evidence from this case? And so often, as I say, an actual objective look at the evidence from this case, not buried in a bunch of weird theories, any
Yes.
reasonable person would say. And in fact, I believe that we should drop the whole notion of custody evaluation, and it should be custody investigation, because what matters is
Mm,
what are the facts,
yes.
not theories, et cetera. And we should not be hiring these. This should not be being done by clinicians. This should be being done by good investigators.
Yeah.
And for example,
Law enforcement.
some of the best work I've seen is done by former law enforcement or former probation officers,
Yeah.
and who they get appointed by a court to do a custody investigation. They do it as an investigation because what matters is what has taken place. Even psychology acknowledges that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Yep.
So what we
Yeah.
need is not all this. We don't need psychologists. We don't need all this theory. We need the facts of what's taken place.
Yeah. So true. Yeah, that's really great. So what I'm hearing you say is evidence-based and really enforcing court orders and not reinforcing the abusive behaviors, but deterring abusive behavior, which the best way to do that, I think, is so simple. Just make them follow the court orders. Well, you can't make them, but, deter them from not following from court orders. I feel like that would do magic if courts would just automatically start enforcing, their orders. So,
If the abuser discovers that the court system is not a way to continue his abuse of the woman,
yes.
over time he loses interest.
Yep.
And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, the court is saying, no, we've got to keep him involved. We've got to keep him involved.
Mm-hmm.
And which serves their financial interests, but they claim that's actually what's best for the kids. It's not what's best for the kids.
Yeah.
A father who wants to stay, a caring, loving father who wants to stay involved is obviously great for kids. A father who will quit because things aren't going his way is a father who was going to be a big problem no matter what.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That would be another interesting discussion would be sometime, Lundy, because you said, well, I didn't think you said this in this discussion, but a batter intervention program. And I know how we brought up the use of language in this conversation. I wonder if maybe phrasing it something else would invite more people who are batterers, coercive controllers to participate in the intervention. You call it intervention programs.
Yeah, the term for decades has been batter intervention program. But yeah, most of us in the field are moving more towards using the term abuser just because it's a little bit less loaded
Yeah.
than batter. Abuser intervention program, abuser counseling.
Yeah. So, anyways, Lundy, is there anything else that you think would be helpful to share now that we're wrapping up that may have been missed?
I always like to say to moms, and this is sort of partly good news and partly bad news, but if the court goes against you, that doesn't guarantee that your relationships with the kids that he's going to succeed in destroying your relationship with your kids.
Yeah.
And if the court decisions go well, that doesn't guarantee that you'll have positive relationships with your kids.
Yeah.
So make sure that your focus is on how do I keep the best relationship with my kids that I can possibly have.
Yeah.
That's what's critical. Their mother when their dad is a domestic violence perpetrator, their relationship with their mom is even more crucial than anybody else's relationship with their mom. And they need you.
Yeah.
And so focus on being close to them, being loving with them. And I know that gets difficult when he's undermining your parenting in all kinds of ways. I'm not saying you can magically do this, but just try to always remember the priority is how close can I be with my kids? How well can I resolve conflicts with them? If they have grievances about me, can I be actually receptive to hearing and listening to those grievances? You shouldn't let your kids trash talk you, but kids who are in some fair, reasonable way raising their complaints, to try to be able to hear those if they're being raised in a fair and reasonable way, so that you can be as close to them as possible, because that's what's going to matter the most to their well-being in the long term, is the quality of your relationship with them.
Yeah, that's really great advice, because I feel like in these types of situations, I don't feel like I know there's so much that a poor survivor cannot control. But that is really good advice, because that is the one thing that the survivor can control. And it kind of, I mean, this is where for me, it just reminds me, this is just me personally sharing, chew the meat, spit out the bones for anybody who doesn't share my faith. But it just reminds me of the Bible verse, don't grow weary in doing good, because in due season it will reap a harvest. And so for me, I personally just do the best I can with what I have. And I just trust that in due season, you know, good will come of it some way, somehow. So that's what that reminds me of for me personally. It reminds me of my faith in that. And, but I think no matter what, that's really a good, good advice, a good sentiment. Lundy, where can people learn more about your work?
My website is just called lundybancroft.com, and it will give you summaries of all my books, and there's a fair bit of information on child custody. There's a resource section with some other places to look for help about different issues. Actually, that resource section is going to be updated soon. So because I've just updated it for a book, and
Nice.
That's where I would point people.
Good. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you for joining us for another episode inside of our series called When Coercive Control Turns Financial, the Family Court Response, and the Cascading Consequences. If you are an organization or an event and you are looking for organizational consulting, speaking, or training so you can understand coercive control better, so you can respond better, I want to invite you to go ahead and visit me at crystalfidelli.com. If you are an individual leaving coercive control and you would like support navigating, I want to invite you to go ahead and also visit me at crystalfidelli.com. And if you are interested in specifically supporting You Made a Way, it is the 501c3 nonprofit that I founded and I am the executive director of. If you are just as passionate as we are of making a way for women and children who are leaving coercive control when it turns financial, I want to invite you to go ahead and visit us at youmadeaway.org. And we hope to see you back here next time for another episode of When Coercive Control Turns Financial, the Family Court Response, and the Cascading Consequences. See you then.